SECfans.com, week 11, talking a big one every year, Auburn and Georgia. And this is a tough one because, Josh, we missed Auburn, Georgia last year when we did the first game. We got the second one right, but we got to do better. We got to get them right in the regular season. Going to remind y'all, please subscribe if you haven't yet. Going to get nerdy with you right now. Please tell us in the comments who you got winning this game, right down there. Tell us who you got winning it. I'll remind you at the end as well, but okay, we're going to talk about it. All right, Josh, Auburn has been up and down this year, inconsistent. We've seen this with Gus Malzahn teams before in the past. It looks like really he's not got the really great defense he had last year, still has a good defense. Some of the things we flagged coming into the season that we got absolutely killed for in the comments have come to fruition. He's not running the ball. Poor O-line, not a great stable of backs. His best running back has been banged up all year. We saw this last year with Kerryon Johnson. Gus Malzahn is at his best when he has a punishing running game. That's how he beat Alabama last year. That's how he beat Georgia last year. And that's why, I don't care what anybody says, Kerryon Johnson was hurt in that Georgia game. He was hurt in that UCF game, and that's why he lost both those games, in my opinion. So that leads me to my first question to kick this whole discussion off. Can Auburn beat Georgia without a running game? Because this past weekend, Auburn beat Texas A&M with not even a threat, a whisper, a consideration for a run game. 19 yards total, could not run the ball, still won 28-24. Stidham had 8.2 yards per attempt, and we've said that Stidham can't throw it well if they're not running the ball, but it turns out that he did pretty well, especially in that second half. So, if Auburn can't run it against Georgia, do they have a prayer?
I would be skeptical. So Georgia's defense in general this year has been poor against the run and good against the pass. We talked about it going into the Kentucky game. I'm going to give us a shout out here. Note that you got the spread exactly right. So you had the Kentucky game 27-10. I think I had 24-13 Georgia. So both of us really saw exactly what we expected out of Georgia-Kentucky game. And a part of that was Kentucky had a good running game and not much of a passing game. We felt like Georgia was either going to give up some running or overcompensate against the run and give up some passing, which ended up being what happened. But there was no way Kentucky was going to be able to do both. And I think one of the interesting things in that game, if you go back and look at it, is that Kentucky couldn't run the ball. Kentucky had 2.4 yards per carry, and they had 7.8 yards per attempt. Now, a lot of that had absolutely to do with what Georgia was doing defensively, that Georgia was not going to let Kentucky run the ball. They were going to dare Wilson to beat them with his arm, which is probably a pretty solid strategy because he hasn't shown the ability to do that against anybody all year. And for about the full first half, Kentucky saw what the box looked like, switched to a pass play, threw the pass, and flailed. Auburn is more successful than Kentucky at throwing the football. I know they have not been great throwing the football, especially at times. I still think Stidham, either he had the yips or there was some issue with his back. He was missing a lot of throws, like the LSU game, especially even like the Tennessee game, throws that he would normally make at a good clip. I don't know when you're playing Georgia if your inability to run the ball is going to come back to bite you because that's Georgia's weakness. And it's kind of weird that Kentucky was able to throw the ball well because really, to me, able to throw the ball well because Georgia was overcompensating against the run, which meant Kentucky couldn't run in the game, and they did throw it well, but they threw it well because they should have been able to run it well, if that makes sense. Georgia is not going to play Auburn the same way. Auburn has not been successful running the ball with any consistency really against anybody they played all year. Ole Miss aside, whose defense should probably go back and start playing JV ball for a while. Outside that, you haven't hit 4.5 yards per carry in FBS play. And that was strangely in the Mississippi State game, but that was kind of weird mix of other factors. So Georgia's going to play Auburn more straight up, let Auburn try to run the ball, and they're going to probably sit with two safeties and say, we'll give up some run plays and let you try to pass. So long explanation there. If Auburn can't run the ball in this game, they're going to not run the ball and then have to deal with Georgia, who's going to be able to bring pin their ears back, come at the quarterback, and drop a lot of guys in coverage. I don't think Auburn has the receivers to beat it. It's a very different situation from Texas A&M, where we saw against Mississippi State and we saw against Auburn. Texas A&M secondary is awful. We knew it early on in the year. We've talked about it all year on this channel. If you subscribe to us, Texas A&M has massive issues in the secondary. We talked about it in the Texas A&M Auburn preview, right? That Renfro really shouldn't be playing college football in the SEC, quite frankly. I'm not trying to hate on the kid, but he's not talented enough to play in this conference. It shows up. Auburn was able to do things in that game because no matter what A&M did, no matter how many guys they dropped, if you can get the ball to a receiver against in air, he's going to catch the ball because the A&M guys can't stop him, and then he's going to run for a long yardage. Georgia is not A&M. That will not work against Georgia, in my opinion. Auburn has to be able to run the ball to sustain drives in this game or force Georgia to bring people in to stop the run. If they're able to do that, then they can throw the ball the way Kentucky did. But Georgia is not going to commit people to the box the way they did with Kentucky until Auburn is able to prove they can run the ball. So, even though it worked for Auburn against A&M without running, even though it worked for Kentucky against Georgia without running, really, and both those are two different situations with a bunch of different circumstances. Auburn has to be able to establish the run this game to force Georgia to play Auburn the way Georgia played Kentucky. Only then, I think, will Stidham be able to have success in the passing game.
All right. True or false? This is the best quarterback Georgia's faced this year outside of Drew Lock.
True.
All right. So I say that to say if Georgia's weakness is the run defense, and I know it's better, but and I'll take an aside here and say both of us picked Georgia to win the game over Kentucky by double digits. And that is not a slight to Kentucky. And this is another thing that kind of pisses me off is that everybody's rushing to downplay wins inside the SEC because everybody hates the SEC or whatever. People immediately ran to downplay this Georgia win versus Kentucky, and that's total crap in my opinion. Kentucky's not an elite team, but they were 7-1 in November, and they had proven to have one of the best defenses in the SEC. They were one-dimensional offensively. So is LSU. LSU's beaten a lot of teams inside and out of the conference. So just a little minor rant. I can't stand when people are immediately going to discredit this Georgia win because now Kentucky sucks all of a sudden. Well, they hadn't sucked until now for the first 8 games, so you got to explain that. But I will say that because Kentucky is so one-dimensional, Georgia could focus on the run game. And like you said, Kentucky broke tendencies so much that it became predictable, but they still were able to focus on the run. If they're playing a team like Auburn that does have a good quarterback, that has kind of had the yips this year, I think that's a good explanation for it. I would also say his offensive line is sort of giving him the yips. But is this a situation where because they're facing a good quarterback with some pretty good receivers, they're not going to be able to focus on the run like they were against Kentucky? And now we're back to the Georgia that struggled on run defense all year, which might help Auburn in the run game, which might bring them to a more balanced offense. And the only balanced offense they've seen all year put up 29 on them. What do you think?
Yeah. I think the issue here really is in large part that I think Auburn's been abandoned as a football team by a lot of people in the national media because they lost that game really to Tennessee. Auburn is not a terrible football team. They lost 1 point to an LSU team that was a lot better than many people anticipated. That was a game that we've talked about a lot in reference to LSU, so I'll bring it up in terms of Auburn. statistically, if you look at, S&P has a bunch of post game statistics on win expectancy. Auburn wins that game 7 out of 8 times against LSU. Auburn,
Explain that. Explain that because you kind of glossed over the key point. Explain that as it relates to statistics in S&P.
right? So, Auburn against LSU, if you look at, their ability to sustain drives, their efficiency, their ability to convert, third downs, yardage, et cetera, et cetera. Auburn post game box score, not really even just box score, but looking per play, like how they did, the situations we're in, how they're able to convert, scoring opportunities, and all those sorts of things. A team with those statistics wins that game 7 out of 8 times. And Auburn managed to lose it anyway. And that has to do with just the variability of football. It was essentially one pass play where I don't think Burrow sees Deshaun Davis, throws over his head, and the receiver runs for a touchdown because two DBs kind of run into each other. That decided the entire game, more or less. And that play, more often than not, is not going to happen. So, that if that play changes and Auburn wins that game, we have a completely different viewpoint of Auburn as a 2-loss team. Maybe maybe not. They beat Tennessee. Tennessee kind of exposed some things, I think, in Auburn in terms of back shoulder throws, which, by the way, is a really concerning thing with Georgia in this game because of how they're able to execute in that way. But that was kind of its own deal. And then Mississippi State, they just had a really good defense, and Auburn wasn't able to get anything going in that period where they were kind of in a funk. But 3-loss Auburn and is not a bad team. They were able to, handle business against Arkansas. They looked rough there for a period. The Texas A&M win, I think, is a very good win. I was high on the A&M bandwagon. I'm kind of jumping off, as everybody does, late in the season against A&M, which is kind of fascinating in its own right.
I tried to get you off the bandwagon last week when I picked Auburn to win that game. I think it was 27-17, and I said you had been hanging on to A&M offensively, and I said, "Are you off that bandwagon? Or when are you going to get off that bandwagon? Will it take one more game?" Now you're saying you're off the A&M bandwagon, at least for 2018.
Yeah, I think I'm hopping off. But the point with all this is Auburn is a better team than they look like. So that is crucial in understanding this game and the matchup against Georgia. I am concerned because the Tennessee game showed the back shoulder throw instability issue. I'm concerned the fact that Georgia is just, in my opinion, a better team and really was to start the year. But Auburn is not a bad team. I don't think Auburn is just dead in the water. The fact that Georgia gives Auburn the ability to run the ball somewhat means Auburn should be able to stay in the game. They couldn't run the ball in LSU. They couldn't run the ball in Mississippi State. They couldn't run the ball in A&M because they're all fantastic run defenses and, frankly, are much better run defenses than Georgia, even if those teams aren't as good as Georgia. And, again, LSU beat Georgia. Now, I think that game was definitely a bit of a fluke. But, there's really, if Auburn is a team that stayed within 1 point of LSU, right? LSU thumped Georgia. I don't believe in the transitive property as it applies, particularly if you try to make logic out of LSU, Georgia, and Florida and how they all beat each other. It doesn't make any sense. This is why transitive property doesn't work. But Auburn is in the same class as LSU. They're as capable of beating Georgia as LSU was. It's not far-fetched. I think Georgia's a better team. I still think Georgia's probably a better team than LSU. But Auburn is absolutely capable of winning this football game.
All right, so I'll ask you the same question in reverse. Is this the best quarterback or passing game that Auburn has faced this year, outside of maybe Ole Miss? Or I'll even include Ole Miss because we have our doubts about them as it relates to actual good defenses.
Yeah, I would say it's the best passing game there too. As you said, Ole Miss's passing game has not translated against a top 40 offense ever under Longo. It doesn't seem to work when they transition away from that freeze offense. They're just it's way too reliant on low percentage plays, and teams can't deal with it. But beyond that, yeah, it nobody else really has a scary passing attack that they played.
All right, so outside of Mississippi State, because there's a three-headed monster there with Aris Williams, Kylan Hill, and Nick Fitzgerald running the ball. Outside of Mississippi State, is this the best running game they've seen all year?
I would say so. Um,
Because Nick Brossette, Edwards-Helaire at LSU, not going to get it done. I mean, Arkansas's got a decent running game. Tennessee, I don't think Ty Chandler's better than Swift or Holyfield. A&M's got a decent run game. What do you think?
no,
Yes or no?
I would agree with it, but I mean, it's just like really quickly here. I mean, I think yeah, Georgia's second in the conference in yards per carry, so yeah, that's pretty fair.
So if we're saying that this is the best, let's say taking the Mississippi State game off the table, even though Mississippi State beat Auburn 23-9 without a quarterback, they could throw the ball. This is the best passing game and second best running game Auburn has faced all year. And I know matchups are important, but is that where the discussion ends? Like, do we just kind of button it up right there and say, Auburn's not going to win this game?
I think the LSU game is the example of why you can't be quite so quick to jump to that conclusion, and the reason for that is all the things you just said were probably true for LSU as well, and it didn't seem to matter. Georgia wasn't able to generate many points. Jake Fromm has been hot and cold this year, and he's definitely been hot. I think the past, maybe the past couple weeks, he's gotten better and executed some throws. Same thing as Stidham. Both those guys were missing throws they routinely hit. Very quietly in the Kentucky game, though, he was still 5.7 yards per attempt. He was 14 of 20. Georgia won that game more or less by running the ball continuously until Kentucky's defense started getting really beat up. They lost guys out of the lineup. Kentucky has no depth, and without that depth, they started giving up run plays. They got exhausted because the offense couldn't sustain drives. Georgia was able to slowly build up a lead, but Georgia was not really able to ever throw the ball with authority in the Kentucky game. They only had 113 yards passing. I think that in this kind of game, there's something to be said for the fact that Georgia has struggled at times with offensively when they face better defenses. The problem, and maybe this is the time to get in the model, the statistics that I have on Auburn related to opponent quality do not currently suggest the proposition that Auburn has an elite defense.
Yeah, go ahead and get in the model.
So, the first thing we generate is percentage of opponent averages allowed. So whatever your opponent's average, 4.5 yards per carry, 7 yards per attempt, what have you, what percentage of that did they get in your game? Auburn has allowed teams to get 86% of their rush average. Georgia's allowed teams to get 96% of their rush average. We put the 95% mark running the ball as average because everything's inflated by your cupcake out of conference bottom 30 games. And you should sort of get ahead of that in a major conference. Auburn at 86%, you can hold teams to pretty low averages. And, Mississippi State is holding teams, for example, to 55% of their rushing averages. So Auburn's run defense is above average at 86%. I would say it's pretty good to a good run defense. A really good run defense like Auburn's last year was something like 67%. It's not nearly as good statistically. To the extent that they look pretty solid, it has a lot to do with the fact that they've played, for example, 3 teams that average under 4 yards per carry. Georgia at 96% is below average. Georgia's run defense is straight up not great. They stepped up to the challenge against Kentucky, should be commended for that. I will also argue Kentucky never bothered to establish the run and what I thought was horrendous play calling for about a quarter and a half. But over the course of the season, including the LSU game where LSU was able to sustain drives running the ball in a way that they have not been able to do in most games, Georgia's run defense hasn't stepped up to the plate. But the big difference is against the pass. It is much harder to stop a team from getting their pass average than it is the run average. Pass averages, we never see this number drop to what we see in the run game. About the best we've ever seen was a high 60 at like 68%. And that was like the 2016 Alabama team. But by and large, if you can get that number below 85%, you're really good. If you get it below 80%, we consider that elite. Auburn though is only giving up 91% of opponent averages. Georgia giving up 82. So Auburn is merely above average as a passing defense, relative to opponent averages. Neutral statistic here, not just. I'm just telling you what the numbers say. Georgia at 82% is a really good pass defense. They're much better at pass defense, Georgia, than they are run. Auburn is a good run defense and merely an okay pass defense. We talked about the Texas A&M Auburn game video. I'm not going to rehash it, but Auburn has no rivals 250 players, or I say rivals 250, or 247s 250 composite, I think is what I used. No top 250 players in their secondary. They've done pretty well with the talent they have. I think it's 3 4-stars, 2 3-stars. But if you don't have top 250 players in your secondary in the SEC, you're gonna have problems. They've got a converted wide receiver in Igbenogany that does pretty well, but he often looks lost and doesn't know his technique. And he's starting at corner, so that's a problem. And as much as Georgia struggled at times against Kentucky, and they struggled against LSU throwing the ball, those teams are much better in the back seven than Auburn. Because of that, Auburn's expected to get about their average run game. That's still only 3.5 yards per attempt, or 3.5 yards per carry, rather. 3.3 specifically. And their pass game, 6 yards per attempt, because Georgia has a good pass defense. Conversely, Auburn can hold Georgia somewhat, but Georgia's still supposed to get 4.7 yards per carry and 8.3 yards per attempt, which is a really good number. That's more than Georgia had per attempt against Tennessee, for example. That's the projected neutral number. So the baseline there is that Georgia's offense is very effective. As a neutral baseline, that's what our model is trying to say. If you take those numbers and you say based off each team's own history, and it builds a unique scoring model for each team based off your own history, it's saying Auburn will get about 22 points with 4.5 yards per play. That's just competent production, but not enough to be very successful. At 6.2 yards per play, Georgia's offense is moving it pretty well, and it expects them to get 31. So 31-22 Georgia over Auburn. A close game, maybe to some, with only a 9-point win, but still a definitive win for Georgia as predicted.
None of this is really surprising to me. I do think, like you said, 22-31 feels like a close score. I don't think it's too far outside the bounds of what, because we have a recency issue here where we don't remember the teams that Auburn beat because they weren't great, and we go back mentally to the Tennessee game, and then we feel like Georgia beat Kentucky and Florida, and those were huge wins, and they were. So it might have the potential to mentally have us underweight Auburn and overweight Georgia, because Georgia still got blown out by LSU, but it's starting to look like that was a bad day, because Georgia's killed a lot of teams this year. That's a mark of an elite team, is when they handle business consistently against average to inferior opponents. So I think Georgia offensively is going to give Auburn some problems. We saw against A&M, the running game was there in stretches, and that's without Mon being an effective passer at all. Right now, that A&M offense is kind of just a total mess. So, not kind of just, it is a total mess. So, I'm going to go a little higher on Georgia. I'm going to go 34 on Georgia, which is what Auburn gave up to Tennessee. 34-20 is going to be my pick.
Yeah, and I as often is the case, we're not too far off from each other. I think Auburn's offense is starting to kind of refine its way a little bit with Stidham. They don't have a great run game, but I think against Georgia, they can run the ball enough to make the offense function. The problem is it's the Garantano issue from that game that I mentioned a couple times throughout this preview. Auburn's secondary does not play the ball very well in the air. It's really a talent issue. They do a very good job with Steele of getting the guys in the position they need to be in to have someone in coverage to make a play when it's there. But the guys they have just aren't very good at the ball in the air. So Georgia with Fromm has been, for the past couple of years, have been great at back shoulder throws. Fromm has not executed them very well, but the past couple of games, those have started to click. That I think is probably the deciding factor in this game. Um, I have it. I'm going to say 37-21, Georgia. I think Georgia maybe scores a little bit more, but we're more or less on the same page here. That for both of us, interestingly enough, I think we're actually kind of picking opposite the model. Indeed, we are. The line just got posted at 13.5 for Georgia. So the model is saying it's model is basically saying this is a slight undercover or fail to cover by Georgia. We're saying it's a slight cover by Georgia, but really it just comes down to the fact of how much faith do you have in Stidham's ability to throw the ball successfully against a pretty good secondary, and then on the other hand, how much or how accurate do you think Georgia is going to be connecting those throws down the field? I think I think this spread at 13.5 is probably dead on. And what you're really looking at is one or two plays in this ball game that go one way or the other is going to kind of decide how it falls on either side of the spread. If this ends up being a one score win, or could even be a close loss by Georgia, though I think that's unlikely, or it could easily go the other way and all of a sudden Georgia wins by 20. We're right at that like 2 touchdown line where I think it's about a 50-50 proposition whether this is a blowout effectively or a very close game.
What's the score look like if this is a game in the fourth quarter?
If it's a game in the fourth quarter, I think it pretty much has to be lower scoring. I haven't seen, other than the last quarter with the A&M game, Auburn has not scored quickly and consistently all year in any game, regardless of competition. And I will throw a caveat, frankly, in the A&M game, they scored quickly in large part because A&M threw a moronic interception straight to the cornerback and gave Auburn the ball in repeated possessions. And the fact that Auburn was able to throw 50-50 balls with that kind of impunity on A&M secondary, I don't think that happens or can happen in this game. Georgia's just too good on the back seven. So it has to be low scoring. If this is a close game, it's probably, like 21-17, something like that, 17-14 even, if Georgia struggles the way they struggled with LSU, though I don't think Auburn's secondary is as good as LSU's. Not a slight, LSU probably has the best secondary in the country at this point. But yeah, definitely is going to be lower scoring if it's close.
One last question. This isn't really about this game as much as it is about Auburn's scheduling. Do you think Auburn should push? Because I don't know if they are the ones that want the scheduling this way, or if this is just kind of how it's landed the last few years for Auburn. Should they push to have Georgia and LSU be opposites in terms of home and away? I'm sorry, Georgia and Alabama be opposites in terms of home and away, and then not care where the LSU game falls, because right now these two games are so close to one another that yes, it was great for them last year that they had Alabama and Georgia, at home at the end of the year. But now the way they've got it set up, it falls every other year where it's just a brutal end to their season. A&M at Georgia, Cupcake at Alabama. That's terrible. That is, to me, I think you're setting yourself up for success every other year and guaranteeing yourself a loss every other year, regardless of how good you are. I think they should say, okay, we don't care where the LSU game falls, home and away, relative to these two other games, but we want these two to alternate. What do you think?
I think it's pretty fair to say that. I mean, Auburn started the year with 5 straight home games. And then in the months of October and November, Auburn will play at home 3 times. In 2 months, Auburn will have 3 home games. That's got to be tough on the players. From a scheduling standpoint, it's really brutal when that goes against you. It's favorable when it goes for you. Part of it is the weirdness with the East rotation right now, where we're doing that one off, one on thing. But by and large, I think this is probably a contributing factor, honestly, to why Auburn has such up and down years. Would you agree with that? That the fact that
I wanted to agree with it, but I went and looked back a couple years ago, and they lost to both in 2015 when they had them at home. So it's unclear at this point. But I could see it being a huge deal in a year that they were actually good and had both teams both of these games away, it costing them a win because you cannot prepare. You don't have, yes, you have the cupcake ahead of Bama, but you're coming off of Georgia and A&M. Like, that's a brutal 4 weeks.
Yeah, well, what I was going to point to was 2017 and 2013 because those were 2 years where they had them both at home. So in the last 3 times that they had those teams both at home, they've won both of them 2 out of the 3 times. In 13 and 17, they won them both. And then in 2015, they did drop them both, but they were. The flip side of that is Auburn was not a really good team in 2015. So you absolutely can't ignore that trend. I think it's a really good point. And I don't think by any means it's a coincidence that Auburn has been so up and down because their schedule. I mean, it's insane. The fact that you play 3 home games in the last 2 months of the year, which are the most vital points of the year, kind of takes your fans out of the equation as a driving force of the team. It means your team's constantly on the road, and it makes the most important games of the year that are going to decide the conference and the divisions a lot harder, and you have to do it repeatedly, where every kind of, every one of those losses compounds itself.
And on the flip side, I think people, because Auburn was, they were a division winner last year. I think if Alabama ended the season with LSU, crappy game, Auburn, and every other year those 2 games were at home, I think people would riot. And so I think the opposite is also true. While I think it's more punitive because they have to have them on the road every other year than it is beneficial to have them both at home, it's still kind of an unfair thing. But again, it's like you're guaranteeing that every other year you might win both those games, and then every other year you might not. So anyway, I feel like we could talk about that all day, but we don't have all day. So that's going to wrap it up for Auburn and Georgia. Remember, give us your scores in the comment section. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Hit the notification button if you want to know when we post, which is generally on Monday. Sometimes do a little bonus content or get the rest of the videos out on Tuesday. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week. God bless.